They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and in the case of a movie, we have a lot of pictures that happen that we call frames. That typically there's 24 frames per second, which are really just pictures flying past your eyes to process it and make movement out of it. In every minute, that gives us 1,440 pictures that our eyes process to kind of piece together parts of this movie. And a typical movie being 90 minutes long gives us 129,600 total frames that we're looking at this entire time to make sense of and make movement. And if we want to tie that back to how many words we have, that's 129,600,000 words, not including spoken dialogue. But let's actually look at how a movie's made. What are the parts that go into it and departments that make up animation? So the typical movie is made up into 3 acts, and these acts each have different parts that tell the story or conflict and world building, which then each act kind of breaks down into smaller pieces, which is what gets processed and moved through in the story. The smallest piece we call a shot, and a shot is kind of like a camera angle for one piece of a scene. Multiple of these shots make up a scene, which drive the story forward somehow, either character development or whatever, and those scenes kind of make up a larger sequence, which end up making the shots or the acts as a whole. But what goes into these shots specifically, as we move through and animate the film, we have to do different things to the pictures to make them look realistic on scene. So what we start with is what we call the layout department, and layout is typically just getting the story pieces together with camera angles, and it's really blocky characters. It's pieces in the movie that aren't realistic looking necessarily, but it gets the sense of what the entire layout of that picture will be, which then moves into animation, where we actually get more emotion from the character. We animate the characters more, we give them more personality and how they react to things and how they move in the scene. That's a lot of the animation pieces there. We're going to move into a little bit more of what we call FX or special effects, which is basically animating anything that's not a character. Things like water and smoke and fire. These are all elements of the story that need to move as well, but aren't directly tied to a character themselves. And we'll move into the lighting department, which actually brings life to a lot of this stuff. It gives shadows and lighting and makes it look very realistic, and usually one of the final stages in making an animated film. The very last step is also what we call stereo or 3D, which literally takes the entire movie and renders it twice. So we have essentially the right or left eye, and we shift everything a little bit and render the other side. But let's look at how these different departments affect what our infrastructure looks like for rendering. So as we go through these different departments, our difficulty for what we need to render and our compute resources goes up pretty drastically. From layout to animation, we're going to get some complexity just in making these scenes, but really around FX and lighting and stereo is where we get a big spike in the amount of compute resources, the amount of machines and computers and stuff like that we need to kind of make this film. And that happens at the shot level, but also at the entire movie level. As you complete more shots in story, not all the shots are completed at the beginning. You complete them as you go. And so at the beginning, you might have 10 or 100 shots ready to kind of animate and go through this process, but you don't get all of the shots until much later. And so you're going to get this huge spike of a lot of shots being worked on simultaneously, which means we're going to need a lot of infrastructure later on in the film, not as much early on. And if you remember the amount of frames we had, there's some data out there that a shot or a frame typically takes about 24 hours to render, which means if we did this all up front, it's going to take us about 355 years to complete rendering this film, not just making it. So we have to do a lot of stuff in parallel. But that also means that we need all this infrastructure around this point and not so much over here at the beginning, because it's just not needed. At the end of all of that rendering, we essentially get a movie. And that's the thing that we take, that's the master, that we send to a movie theater, and that's what they play on their screen. So in a lot of cases, this is a physical piece of media that we take, such as a hard drive, and sometimes it's digitally sent through different secure mechanisms and encryption. But that's essentially the whole piece of how the movie gets made and where some of this infrastructure fits in.